Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of my Life in Landscape series. Welcome back into the Cozy Studio. We are ready for our next prompt, and today's prompt is Misty Mystery. Now, if you've seen watercolour paintings, whether you've done it yourself or seen it on socials, you'll know that misty landscapes are one of the core paintings that people love to do and they love to see. It's using a lot of wet on wet technique today, so make sure that you are ready for that. Today's reference photo is another photo of mine, also from France, ironically. But it is a beautiful lone pine tree in the middle of a misty landscape. I'm so excited to get started on this painting with you. I will flag. Unfortunately, at a couple of times, my battery did run out and I didn't realize. So we're going to have a couple of jumps. Sorry about that, pals. But I do talk you through what you missed out on. So you'll still be able to follow along. And I cannot wait to see what paintings you create today. Let's get going. So for this artwork, we are going to be working with a lot of wet on wet technique, which means our piece of paper is going to be holding a lot more water than perhaps in other methods. To try and combat this a little bit and making it so that I don't have to constantly hold down the paper as I'm using big sweeping motions, I've decided to use some painter's tape or masking tape to not only fix my piece of paper down to the surface I'm working on, but it'll also give me some beautiful crisp lines and a bit of a border once we are finished. So I'm just using the width of the tape as a guide and masking it all up. Now for the painting itself, we are going to start with the very background of the painting, the misty horizon line. And the colour I'm mixing up here is a grey with a tinge of blue in it. Once I've got the colour happy, I'm actually going to pull out my bigger, fluffier brush. You want it to be pretty wet and you want to wet down the whole surface of the paper where you want your sky to be. We're going to concentrate the pigment on the horizon line towards the middle of the page. As you can see, I'm using my big fluffy brush to pick up a little bit of that pigment. It's not really showing up much on camera. Remember that once it dries, it'll actually be a bit more visible. It's a little bit difficult with the shininess of the camera, I apologize. So as you can see, I went through that pigment very quickly, so I'm mixing up a little bit more of my grey and blue. I'm using a smaller brush to do this. It's easier for me to manage with my half pans. I then grab my fluffy brush again while it's still wet, and you'll notice that the page is still wet as well. You want to be working on a very wet surface for your paper for a wet on wet technique. You can see that when I'm applying the pigment to the paper, I am concentrating at the middle, and then I am using a cleaner brush to blend the pigment all the way up to the top of the page so there are no harsh lines. What I'm doing here is I'm again grabbing that grey with a slight bit of blue in it, and I'm starting to use a zigzag motion with my brush to start to give the illusion of soft trees in the distance. They definitely don't want to be too detailed and defined, so you will see that I'm using a clean brush with a little bit of water on it to pull the pigment up and around and move it on the page so that it softens out at the top and no harsh lines are forming. I'm moving pretty quickly. The paper is still wet and I want it to kind of blur out and bleed into the page a little bit. Now, while that starts to dry up, we're going to start on the foreground towards the bottom of our page, which is our green landscape. I'm mixing up a colour that is quite a vibrant green as per our reference photo and testing it out on my scrap piece of paper. While I've been mixing up my colour, I've noticed that in our horizon line there's a bit of blooming happening, and this is where, as the paint is drying on the wet on wet, there are some lines forming where one section of the paper is drier and the pigment is creating a bit of a squiggly line. It's the best way to describe it because I know it's a little bit hard to tell in this video. So what you've seen me do just here is grab my dry cloth and pad some of the excess water off. I'm then using a clean, slightly damp brush to go over the top of where those blooms are happening and actually use my dry cloth to again pull those little lines of pigment back up off the page. Once I'm happy, I dive back into our foreground with the green. As you can see, I'm sketching out the boundary for our front meadow and coating that surface in the green. We're going to build up the layering and the depth later on. Once that's done, we're going to move on to the backfield, leaving a small strip of white in between your meadows, because as you'll notice in our reference photo, there's a channel of brown, the little boundary line around the meadows, that we'll add in later. For now, we just want to get the green laid down. While we leave that base to dry, we're going to move back onto our horizon line. Now that that area is dry, we can build up the layer. I'm mixing up again once more of our grey with a bit more blue in it this time. I want the colour to be a bit darker. And as you can see, I'm using short choppy brush strokes to sketch in a tree line. Doesn't need to be exactly like our reference photo. Have a bit of fun of it. You want to have some areas to be a bit taller than others to have a bit of variation to it, like a normal forest would. Once you've sketched that in, come back in with a clean wet brush to start blurring out the edges of our pigment. We still want it to be very soft. As you can see here, I did leave it a little bit longer. I would suggest that you sketch in part of your trees and then blur them out while they're still wet. Otherwise, you will have to apply a little bit more vigor in your wet brush over the top to try and blur out those harsh edges. It can be done, it just means a little bit more effort. So my suggestion is put down your pigment and immediately use a clean brush with a little bit of water on it to blur out your edges. Now while that dries, we move back onto our foreground and we're going to build up the detail and depth in that front meadow that is going to be sitting underneath our pine tree. We want a really dark coloured green here, and don't be afraid to add some black as you're mixing up your colour. Once you're happy, apply it from the centre. As with all of my suggestions, I say start with the darkest area and then use water to pull the pigment out across the page. Noting that the more water that you add to your colour as you're working on it, the lighter it's going to become anyway. So it's always easiest to start off with the darkest point. Once you've got that kind of oval shape of the darkest point around it, lighten up the colour either through adding more of a lighter green, some yellows to your pigment, or just more water, and start sketching in around, as you can see I'm doing here. I'm using short choppy brush strokes. Don't actually want this to be too smooth. The grass is quite choppy, it's got some divots in it, so we don't mind having a bit of texture here. We don't need it to be beautifully smooth. And just keep working your way around the semicircle until you've covered the full area of that front meadow. As you're painting, you may decide that you want some areas to be darker than others. Keep adding your pigment. I find that working while the page is still slightly damp makes it easiest to blend your layers into one another. While we don't mind having some choppiness, it is nice to have a bit of cohesiveness as you're working. As my paint has started to dry, I've realized that that center area that I started as darkest has dried a bit lighter than I wanted. So I'm going back in with a little bit more of a darker pigment and then once again working my way around to blend it out. Now, in looking at our reference photo, the grass isn't a pure green, so I'm going to add a little bit more of a yellow-brown toned green to that left side, that left boundary of the meadow. I'm then using a clean brush to stipple along the surface of the meadow to give it an even choppier look, to pick up those kind of textures and divots in the grass. Keep working your way around the grass and playing with it until you're comfortable. Next, we're going to move back to our horizon line and we're going to add up another layer to our misty landscape. I am by no means an expert on misty landscapes. It's something that I am still developing my skills around, but I have found that this layering technique is what's most comfortable for me. And as someone who's maybe just starting out, I would suggest this as a place to go if you're looking to build a layered misty landscape. So, as you can see here, I've got this darker grey, slightly green toned this time, because keeping in mind the trees that are at the very front of our horizon line are going to be most defined. So you're going to notice some of that green colour coming through, as this is a little pine forest. As with our previous layers, we are starting by placing the pigment at its most dark point on the page, using short, choppy upwards strokes to give the illusion of our pine trees, and then using a clean, damp brush to blur out the tops of those. We still don't want them to be too defined. They're off in the distance, and we want to have it fade off as though we have some mist hanging over the tops of our trees. Once we've got that to a point that we're comfortable with, we're going to move back into our foreground to our meadow. We're going to move into the back right-hand meadow, pulling in the green colour that we've used down in the front meadow. But you'll notice from the reference photo that the top of this also has a little bit of yellow to it. So we're going to mix up a yellow and brown with our green and blend it in. Now, once I've got the colour to a point that I'm happy with, again using our spare piece of paper to test the colour, I'm applying it liberally to the page, not really caring if it touches that green at all. In fact, I kind of want them to blend together a bit. As you can see here, I'm using my cloth to do a little bit of lifting off to lighten some of the areas that I want to be a little bit lighter. It's one of the most useful techniques that I have found to not necessarily erase pigment off the page, but to manipulate it a little bit further. As you can see, I'm applying a little bit of water to the center to lift off a bit more, and adding in those dark areas. This gives it a little bit more depth and dimension to that back hill. I'm then starting on the left-hand side meadow. You can see that I'm working with that brown color, layering it while it's still wet with some of the green, playing around and not being too fussed, but doing what I can to reflect what I'm seeing in the reference photo of the lighter and darker areas, where it's more green, where it's more brown. Okay, now I'm going to let that dry now that I'm pretty happy with it. And I'm going to move back to our horizon line, and I just want to grab a little bit of black and with a tinge of green to it and add it to the very base of our horizon line where those trees meet that back meadow. Very short upward strokes so that it's not a clean line across on the top, but still providing some definition between the meadow and the trees. At this point, I'm just going around the painting with what we've done so far, particularly around our meadows, and just adding in any extra details, any areas that need a little bit of work, softening up any blooming that I don't want to happen, and as you can see here, softening even further that horizon line with the trees. I'm adding back in some detail on our left-hand side of our painting, noticing that there is a thicker band of trees. I'm also going to sketch in the little house that you will see in our reference photo, starting out with sketching in the shape of our roof in a nice brown colour. It's pretty small, so it will be a little bit harder to bring depth into it, so I'm not going to focus on that too much. It's okay that it's the one colour. You won't be able to notice it. Next up, I'm bringing in the brown for those channels in between our meadows. Now, whether those are actual channels of dirt, whether it is a boundary fence made out of wood or a brown toned stone, I'm not sure. But all we're going to do is use those white gaps that we've left in between our meadows to add a little bit of that brown colour to it that we can see in our reference photo. And once that horizon is a little bit drier, I go back in again with some more short upward strokes to put some detail in of the pine trees on the right hand side of our horizon there. Noting that those are a bit more in the foreground, so it's okay that we see some of the lines. I will soften it up, as you can see here, with a clean, damp brush and using my dry cloth to lift off any excess pigment from the top, really concentrating the pigment and the colour at the base. Now, unfortunately, in a couple of seconds, we're going to jump ahead because I didn't realize that my camera ran out of battery while I was going ahead with this painting. I was too in the zone. So I will just say, add in a little bit of detail using a fine tip brush into the house. Do whatever you can based off the reference photo, and add in using a dark brown, add in some detail to those channels. You'll see shortly what I mean and what I've done here. There. So to start with our pine tree, you're going to hold the paintbrush at the very end of it using a very light touch with a dark coloured green, and you're going to let the paintbrush very naturally fall down the page. Now to start adding in those branches, I want you to again keep holding the paintbrush at the end. This gives a more natural and less stilted stroke. And just working your way down, just kind of eyeballing, looking at the reference photo constantly to see where are the branches coming out, what angles are they at. I'm using the same very dark shade of green, which I'll show you later how we add up a bit more depth. But to get this green, I'm using a lot of a darker blue and a bit of black, as well as my base coloured green. So I'm sketching in. The further you get towards the base, the thicker the tree is. So I'm not too worried about the individual branches here because it's actually going to be a bigger area of green to coat in, whereas at the very top of the tree, they're quite sparse. So I am being a little bit more careful of my brush strokes and my placement of the branches. To add a little bit more detail in around those branches, I'm using short and choppy brush strokes. Now again, my camera ran out of battery without me realizing it, so there is going to be a little bit of a time jump coming ahead. I want you to continue working your way around the tree, remembering that as we get to the base, it's thicker. So we're actually just going to fill in that space with our dark green paint, and then we're going to go back over it with the rest of the tree in adding a little bit more detail. So here is where my camera ran out of battery, unfortunately, and you can see I have filled in that space with the dark green colour. What I'm doing now is going in with an even darker colour, so think mostly black and blue with only a little bit of our base green. And I'm going over the darkest areas of our tree. That's where the branches are thickest, so think the middle of our brush strokes, not necessarily the tips. We want to keep the tips a lighter colour. I'm going over particularly this base area just with some short choppy brush strokes, again mixing up some more paint as needed to keep it as dark and vibrant as I can, using swooshing, crisscrossing motions, because remembering I want to follow the direction of the branches as they're growing out of the tree. And I just keep working my way down the tree, adding detail, particularly adding some darkness towards the base, because that's the area that's getting the least amount of light. And this is the final step in our painting. So continue on until you are happy enough with it. And then the very final step, which is always the very most satisfying if you have chosen to use some masking tape or painter's tape around the edges, our very last step is to remove that tape, revealing our beautiful crisp lines with our white border. I peel it off on an angle, on about a 90-degree angle from where it's been laid down. This minimizes how much paper would lift off. And with that, we are done today's painting. I hope you have enjoyed this process and learnt a little bit. Please tag me in any of your final artwork pictures, and I'll see you for the next one.